65,000 years. That's not a number you throw around lightly. That's longer than the entire span of ancient Egypt. Longer than the rise and fall of Greece and Rome combined. Longer than every dynasty of China stacked together. For 65,000 years, people walked this continent. They named every hill, every river, every waterhole. They sang maps into existence so precise that children could follow them across deserts without ever getting lost. They shaped the landscape with fire so cleverly that the very plants and animals learned to live with them. They buried their dead with ceremony, painted stories on rock walls that still speak today, and raised children who knew the stars better than most modern astronomers know their own neighborhoods. This was no empty wilderness waiting for discovery. This was a living, breathing, governed, loved, fought for, sung about land. Home to hundreds of nations, hundreds of languages, hundreds of thousands of souls. Then, in 1788, tall wooden ships appeared on the horizon like ghosts from another world. The men who stepped ashore looked at the smoke rising from distant camps, heard voices calling warnings in languages they could not understand, saw canoes slicing the water, saw spears glinting in the sun, and wrote in their official documents, "This land belongs to no one." They planted a flag. They built a penal colony. They began to divide, fence, mine, graze, and claim. As if the people who had tended this place for longer than memory could reach had never existed. How do you look at a continent full of life, full of law, full of history, and declare it legally vacant? How do you turn 65,000 years of human presence into a blank page? That single act of erasure wasn't ignorance. It was a choice, a deliberate, calculated, profitable choice. And its shadow still falls across every conversation about land, identity, and justice in Australia today. This is the story of the people who are undeniably here first, and the astonishing fiction that tried, and still tries, to pretend they weren't. Long before any European map marked this continent, people had already been living here for an almost unimaginable stretch of time. Archaeological layers show clear signs of human activity stretching back at least 65,000 years, some of the earliest evidence of modern humans leaving Africa and reaching a new landmass anywhere in the world. They crossed open ocean in planned voyages during lower sea levels, arriving when the continent looked very different. Wetter, with giant animals roaming the plains. Over the next 40,000 years, they spread across every environment. Rainforests in the north, vast deserts in the center, icy Tasmania in the south. They developed incredibly sophisticated ways of living. They used controlled fire to manage the landscape, burning in precise patterns that encouraged new growth and created open hunting grounds. They built elaborate stone fish traps that still function today, some stretching hundreds of meters. They created vast trade networks stretching thousands of kilometers, exchanging tools, ochre, shells, and knowledge. Their oral traditions, songlines, encoded detailed maps of the land, water sources, sacred sites, and seasonal changes. These songs functioned as living GPS systems passed down for hundreds of generations. By the time European ships arrived, somewhere between 300,000 and 1 million people lived across the continent, speaking more than 250 distinct languages and belonging to hundreds of distinct nations and clans. They had complex kinship laws, marriage rules, initiation ceremonies, and spiritual systems that bound people to country in ways Europeans simply did not understand. This was not an empty wilderness. It was a continent shaped and cared for by its people for longer than the entire span of recorded European history. In 1770, Captain James Cook sailed up the east coast on the Endeavour. His journals record repeated encounters. At Botany Bay, he and his crew met people who shouted warnings, threw spears, and lit signal fires. Further north, they saw huts, canoes, fishing weirs, and smoke rising from camps. Cook himself wrote that the people appeared numerous along the coast. Yet when he reached Possession Island in August 1770, he raised the British flag and claimed the entire eastern half of the continent for King George III. He did this without any treaty, without any negotiation, and without acknowledging the people he had already met. 13 years later, in 1788, the first fleet arrived at Sydney Cove. Governor Arthur Phillip's instructions were clear: establish a colony. Again, no treaties were made, no recognition of existing ownership. Instead, the land was treated as vacant. The people who had lived there for 65,000 years were simply overlooked in the legal paperwork. Why? The answer lies in the thinking of the time. European international law at the end of the 18th century allowed settlement of lands that had no recognized sovereign, no fixed agriculture, and no system of individual property ownership that matched European models. Hunter-gatherer societies with seasonal movement and collective responsibility for land did not fit that definition. So the British declared the continent effectively empty, a legal fiction that made colonization simple and cheap. From the very first days of settlement, every piece of land was claimed by the British Crown. Aboriginal people could not sell land, could not grant permission, could not even be compensated in any formal way. When violence broke out, and it did almost immediately, the official position was that the newcomers were defending their territory. Frontier clashes, massacres, and forced removals were carried out under the assumption that the original inhabitants had no prior rights worth recognizing. This approach continued for more than 150 years. Entire nations were pushed onto small reserves or mission stations. Children were taken from families under assimilation policies. Laws treated Aboriginal people as wards of the state rather than owners of the land. All of this rested on that single, extraordinary pretense that the continent had been empty when the British arrived. Even when explorers and settlers saw thriving communities, traded with them, fought against them, and sometimes married into them, the official legal position never changed. The land belonged to the Crown because, according to the law of the time, nobody had owned it before. For 2 centuries, this legal story held. Then, in 1992, everything shifted. A group of Meriam people from the Murray Islands in the Torres Strait took their case all the way to the highest court in the country. Eddie Mabo and others argued that their people had never lost their connection to their islands, and that the old idea of an empty continent was simply wrong. The court agreed. In a landmark ruling, it declared that the assumption of Terra Nullius had been based on a false premise. Australia was not empty in 1788. Native title, the continuing rights and interests of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, had always existed and still existed wherever it had not been legally extinguished. That single decision overturned more than 200 years of official history. It forced every level of government to begin recognizing that the continent had owners long before 1788. It opened the door to native title claims across the country. It changed how history is taught and how land is managed. But the ruling also made clear that much had already been lost forever. Freehold titles, mining leases, and past government actions could not be undone. So, why did Britain pretend the continent was empty? Because admitting the truth would have changed everything. It would have required treaties, negotiations, shared power, and recognition of existing laws. It would have made colonization far more complicated and expensive. Instead, the convenient fiction of an empty land allowed the rapid establishment of a new society built on dispossession. The people who had been here for 65,000 years, who had survived ice ages, rising seas and megafauna extinctions were written out of the story with a stroke of a pen. Yet their presence never actually disappeared. Their stories, their knowledge, their connection to country endured. And today that endurance is being recognized more clearly than ever before. They were here first. The evidence stretches back tens of thousands of years. The ships that arrived in 1788 did not discover an empty land. They encountered one of the oldest continuous cultures on Earth. The decision to pretend otherwise was not ignorance. It was a deliberate legal and political choice that shaped a nation. The question is no longer whether they were here first. The question is what we do with that truth now. Which part of this story surprised you most? The 65,000-year timeline, the moment of contact, or the day the highest court finally said the continent was never empty? Drop your thoughts below. If you want more deep dives into forgotten histories, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. We're just getting started. Thanks for watching, and stay curious.